You're here, but your mind isn't. Your body is in this room. It's in this moment. It's breathing, occupying physical space in the real world, but your head is somewhere else entirely. It's in the meeting you have tomorrow that you still don't know how it's going to go. It's in the conversation you need to have that you've been postponing because you don't know how the other person is going to react. It's in the result you're waiting for that isn't coming, and that with each hour it doesn't come seems more ominous. It's in the problem that might arrive, that might not arrive, that might be different from how you imagine it, but that regardless occupies all the mental space that should be available for what's happening right now. And meanwhile, your real life is passing. Not in the future where your mind lives. Here, in this moment, in this conversation with the person beside you, in this meal you're eating without tasting, in this sky you didn't look at because you were too busy calculating the probabilities of disasters that will probably never happen, in this child who spoke to you and whom you answered but without being truly present because part of you was still living in tomorrow. That's anxiety. It's not just worry. It's not just nervousness before something important. It's the state of permanently living in an invented future, while the present, the only moment where life actually happens, passes without being inhabited. And it's costing you more than you think. Welcome to episode 5 of Master Your Mind. This is Stoicism for Winners. In the 4 previous episodes of this series, we built the complete foundation of the first block. The first woke you to the reality that you've been living as a slave to your emotions. The second gave you the most fundamental instrument of all this work, the space between stimulus and response, that instant where your freedom lives. The third stripped anger bare as the emotion that destroys outward, that disguises itself as strength when it's exactly the opposite, that impoverishes in every area that matters. And the fourth examined fear, the emotion that paralyzes inward, that lies about the future with a consistency and efficiency that's astonishing when you finally see it. Today we begin the second block of this series. And we begin it with something that is, in many ways, the fear that learned to live with you permanently. In the previous episode, we talked about fear as a response to something specific and concrete, a clear object, an identifiable threat. Fear of that conversation, fear of that result, fear of that specific decision in front of you. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is fear without clear direction, diffuse fear, fear that doesn't point toward anything concrete but colors everything with a layer of threat that has no precise name but is felt constantly. The state of permanent alert against enemies you can't fully see because they're not fully there yet. Maybe they'll never be fully there, but that, regardless, keep your nervous system in a state of preparation for danger that consumes energy 24 hours a day without producing anything in return. Fear has an object. Anxiety floats. Fear mobilizes you towards something concrete. Anxiety paralyzes you chronically. Fear, though it charges its price, at least points. Anxiety charges its price without pointing at anything in particular, which makes it harder to identify, harder to examine, and harder to work with, and it's epidemic. Not just in the clinical numbers any mental health statistic can give you, which are brutal, but in the everyday experience of millions of people who don't call it anxiety because they disguise it as other things. They disguise it as responsibility, as caution, as being someone who takes things seriously, as being a parent who thinks about their children's future, as being a professional who doesn't leave things to chance. And in those disguises, there's a grain of truth that makes the confusion completely understandable. Worrying about the future can be responsibility. It can be planning. It can be the behavior of someone who takes seriously what matters to them. But there's a point where worry stops being planning and becomes something different. The point where you're no longer thinking about the future to decide what to do now. You're thinking about the future to suffer it before it arrives. And that suffering produces no useful result. It doesn't solve the problem it anticipates. It doesn't prepare you better for what might happen. It only makes you pay for something that may never come, or that if it comes will be different from how you imagined it. That's the trap of anxiety, and there are 3 men who lived nearly 2,000 years ago who saw it with a clarity that still hasn't been surpassed today. The first is Seneca. Picture this scene. You're writing a letter. The year is approximately 63 AD. You're over 60 years old. You've survived exile. You've survived being tutor to an emperor who became a tyrant. You've lived in proximity to the most dangerous and unpredictable power in your world for decades. And now, in these last years of your life, you're writing letters to a friend, to Lucilius, with the urgency of someone who knows the remaining time is finite, and that there are things that need to be transmitted before it's too late. And in one of those letters, writing from the experience of someone who had real reasons for anxiety about the future and who observed for years what that anxiety cost versus what it produced, he tells Lucilius something that has been exactly true for 20 centuries. The man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. He doesn't suffer equally, he suffers more, because he suffers twice. The first time in imagination, with all the emotional intensity of anticipated suffering, but without the limits real suffering has. And the second time in reality, if reality actually arrives, which frequently it doesn't, or it arrives in a form so different from what you anticipated that the prior suffering served as preparation for nothing. The second is Marcus Aurelius. Picture another completely different moment. You're the most powerful ruler in the known world. You've been on military campaign for years. You've seen the devastation of the Antonine Plague that killed millions. You've been betrayed by people you trusted. You've lost children. You've governed in conditions that would have justified the chronic anxiety of any reasonable human being. And what you write in your meditations isn't about the future you fear. It's about the present you have. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that has been the most precise answer to anxiety ever formulated for 2,000 years. Never be disturbed by what has not yet happened, because the present is the only thing you truly possess. The future doesn't exist yet, and when it arrives, it will no longer be the future. It will be the present. And you'll face it then, with the resources you have then, not with the imagined resources of anticipated suffering now. The third is Epictetus, whose story you already know, and who taught something about anxiety that is, in many ways, the most powerful tool in this entire series for working with it at the root. The dichotomy of control. What depends on you and what doesn't depend on you. Anxiety, Epictetus taught, is born precisely from confusing those two categories, from worrying with the same intensity or more intensity about what you can't control as about what you can, from spending mental energy on the outcome which you don't control instead of spending it on the action which you do control. A man who completely understands that distinction and lives according to it cannot be anxious in the same way, because he knows exactly what deserves his attention and what doesn't. He knows what he can change with his action and what he can't change with any amount of worry, and from that clarity he acts on what he can change and releases what he can't. These 3 men, Seneca, from the urgency of the last years of a life, lived at the edge of the most dangerous power. Marcus Aurelius, from the throne of the world, amid crises that gave no rest. Epictetus, from the slavery that taught him that real control is never in external circumstances, arrived at the same conclusion about anxiety, that it destroys the present, that it charges a real price for something that may never come, and that there's a way out. Not easy, not instant, but real and practicable. The phrase that accompanies you today is this: the present is the only thing I truly have. Every time your mind goes to the future, every time it starts building scenarios of what could go wrong, every time anxiety starts charging its advance tax on misfortunes that may never arrive, the present is the only thing I truly have. Let's begin. First Stoic lesson. Anxiety is fear without direction, a state of permanent alert against enemies that don't exist and that probably will never appear. To work with anxiety, you need to understand first exactly what it is. Not as a clinical category, though that matters too, but as lived experience, as what actually happens in your mind and body when anxiety is present, what differentiates it from ordinary fear, why it's harder to manage, and why the instruments that work with specific fear don't always work the same way with anxiety. Ordinary fear, the kind we examined in the previous episode, has an object. It points towards something specific and concrete. You fear that conversation. You fear that medical result. You fear that specific decision in front of you. Though the story it builds about that object is exaggerated, though it amplifies risk beyond its real proportions, at least it has something concrete to point toward. And that makes it, in a way, more manageable. Because you can examine the object. You can ask yourself what real probability the worst-case scenario has. You can apply the premeditatio malorum we saw in the previous episode and give a defined size to what you fear. You can eventually act, which is the only real way to reduce specific fear. Anxiety doesn't work that way. Anxiety doesn't have a clear object you can examine and give a size to. It floats. It's a diffuse sense of threat that doesn't point toward any specific place with enough clarity to be examined directly. It's the sense that something is wrong, or could be wrong, or could be wrong soon, or could become worse than it seems right now, without being able to identify precisely what that something is, or when it's going to arrive, or how it's going to present itself. And that diffuse character, that lack of clear object, is what makes it especially exhausting. Because your nervous system can't distinguish between a real threat and a story about a possible future threat. It responds to both with the same chemistry, the same activation, the same state of preparation for danger that in real threat circumstances gives you the energy to respond, but that in imaginary threat circumstances only consumes you without producing anything. When an animal in nature senses fear before a real predator, the stress response activates, the animal flees or fights, and when the danger passes, the nervous system returns to its resting state. The cycle completes. The body returns to balance. Anxiety doesn't complete that cycle. The imaginary threat never reaches resolution because it's not really there. The nervous system activates, but there's nothing concrete to act on to resolve the threat. And so it remains in a state of alert that never fully deactivates because the danger signal doesn't resolve, because there was no real danger to resolve. That's what produces the chronic exhaustion of anxiety. You're not responding to real threats. You're responding to the threat signal your mind produces without a real threat behind it. And that response, sustained for hours, for days, for months or years, has a physical and emotional cost that accumulates in ways that eventually become impossible to ignore. Seneca observed this with a precision that comes from someone who lived in proximity to real danger for years, and who learned to distinguish between what deserved the alarm response and what was his mind producing alarm about possibilities that might never materialize. He wrote that there are people who worry about everything possible, who can't see a cloud without imagining a storm, who can't hear a piece of news without building the worst possible scenario from it, who live in a state of preparation for disaster that consumes all their energy without the disaster arriving with the frequency that would justify that level of permanent preparation. And what he saw in those people is that the price they paid for that constant preparation was higher than the price they would have paid if the worst scenario they anticipated had actually arrived. They paid more for anticipating it than for living it. Because living something, though difficult, has a limit. Anticipating it indefinitely has none. Marcus Aurelius added something that completes this understanding. He wrote that what happens never disturbs us. What disturbs us is what we believe about what happens. And this applies especially to anxiety, which frequently isn't produced by what's happening right now, but by what you believe might happen later. That distinction is crucial. If what produces your anxiety is your belief about the future, and not the future itself, then there's a lever available that isn't always visible from inside the anxiety. The belief can be examined. Not always easily, not all at once, but it can be seen with more clarity than it seems from inside the anxious state where the belief feels like reality. This is your assignment for this first lesson. Today, when you notice anxiety is present, when you feel that diffuse sense of threat that doesn't point toward any completely clear place, ask yourself this question with the greatest precision you can. What is this anxiety pointing toward in this specific moment? Not to solve the problem it signals, just to see it, to give it the most specific, concrete name you can. Instead of diffuse anxiety without an object, it can become something more manageable when you give it a name and limits. It doesn't always work completely. Anxiety has a nature that doesn't disappear just because you name it. But naming it is the first step toward not being completely governed by it. Do it today. Second Stoic lesson. Seneca wrote that the man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary, and you've spent years suffering over things that never came. This lesson requires you to do something difficult, to honestly calculate the real price you've paid for anxiety. Not in abstract terms, in concrete, verifiable terms. The price in time, in energy, in presence, in the things you weren't fully there to live because part of you was in the future, where anxiety lives. Seneca put it with mathematical precision that has nothing poetic about it, though it sounds that way. The man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. More. Not equally. More. Why more? Because anticipated suffering accumulates in ways real suffering can't. Real suffering happens once. When the difficult situation arrives, you live it with all its intensity, which can be high, and then it passes. It leaves something behind, learning, or scar, or change. But it passes. It has its beginning and its natural end. Anticipated suffering has none of those limitations. It can begin weeks before the event that generates it arrives. It can be revisited for days. It can reproduce itself in slightly different variations each time the mind returns to the topic. It can occupy the small hours of the night when the body wants to rest, but the mind keeps building scenarios. It can keep growing with each new piece of information your mind interprets as additional evidence that the worst-case scenario is becoming more likely. And it can do this for months about something that's never going to materialize the way you fear. Think about this with the concreteness it deserves. Think of the 3 nights you woke at 3 in the morning thinking about something you had to face the next day or the following week. Heart racing. Mind-building disaster scenarios with an efficiency that, in another context, you might admire. How many of those nights did the disaster you anticipated occur exactly as you imagined it in that 3 in the morning state of alarm? The honest answer, almost certainly, is very few or none. The difficult things that came arrived in ways you hadn't anticipated exactly, and the things you anticipated with the most intensity frequently didn't arrive in any form. And meanwhile, you paid the price of those nights. The price in sleep you didn't recover. In energy you used building imaginary catastrophes instead of resting to face whatever actually came. In the next day's irritability that affected relationships with people who had nothing to do with what worried you. In the performance that dropped because body and mind were tired from anticipating instead of resting. That price is real, and it was paid for something that in most cases never happened the way that generated the price. Picture this scene. Seneca is in his final years. He's survived things that at the time would have seemed impossible to survive. He lived through exile, proximity to a tyrant, the loss of everything he'd built more than once. And from that perspective, from the clarity of someone who can look back over decades of lived life and see the pattern with a sharpness only distance allows, he writes something about the cost of anticipated suffering that hasn't aged a single day. He writes about people who worry about everything possible, who anticipate every imaginable disaster, who live in a state of permanent preparation for catastrophes that rarely arrive with the frequency or magnitude that would justify that permanent preparation. And what he sees in those people is something he himself had to learn over time, that the price they pay for anticipating suffering is frequently greater than the price they would have paid if the suffering they anticipated had actually arrived. Chronic anxiety charges more than the disasters it fears. Not always. Some disasters are genuinely devastating. We're not minimizing that. But the relationship between what anxiety charges in advance and what actually arrives as real suffering is, in most lives, profoundly unbalanced against whoever lives it. You pay more than you should, much more, and you pay in advance, before knowing whether the disaster will come. While you destroy the present, you have to pay the price of a future that may never materialize. Marcus Aurelius understood this from a perspective that gave him unique authority on this topic. As emperor governing during decades of real crises, real plagues, real wars, real betrayals, he had the necessary perspective to distinguish between what deserved genuine worry and attention and what was his mind building additional threats on top of those that already existed. And in his meditations, written for himself in the most difficult moments of his governance, he writes repeatedly about the importance of not adding imaginary suffering to real suffering, of not multiplying the pain that already exists by adding the anticipated pain of what might come on top of it. Real suffering is already demanding enough. It doesn't need you to multiply it with the imagined suffering of everything that might be added to what's already there. This is your assignment for this second lesson. Think of something that generated anxiety for you during weeks or months in the last year. Something concrete that you remember, that consumed real energy over real time. And honestly write down what actually happened. Not what you feared, what happened. And then calculate, as honestly as you can, how much anticipated suffering you paid versus how much real suffering was produced by what finally happened or didn't happen. That calculation, That contrast between the price paid and what actually arrived is information your mind needs to start calibrating the relationship between what anxiety anticipates and what reality produces. Do it today. There's more about this second lesson that deserves development before continuing, because the calculation I asked you to make about the price of anxiety versus what actually arrived has a dimension that's harder to quantify, but that's perhaps the most significant. The price in presence, not the price in sleep or energy, which are already significant. The price in the moments that were in front of you and that you didn't fully inhabit because anxiety had you living elsewhere. Epictetus observed something about anxiety that only someone who's observed the human condition from the distance slavery provides can see with such clarity. Picture this scene. You're in Nicopolis, at your school. The students who come to learn from you are young people from well-off families, people with access to resources and opportunities Epictetus never had. People with considerable external freedom who nevertheless spend their time living in imagined futures instead of in the present they have. And Epictetus watches them with the curiosity of someone who knows from the inside what it means not to have control over external circumstances, and who sees people with that control spending it worrying about what might change instead of using it on what they already have. What he tells them isn't to stop worrying, it's something more precise. That they're paying the price of the future with the currency of the present, and that when the future finally arrives, if the future arrives in the form they fear, they'll have to pay its price again. But they'll have already spent the present they had without actually using it. They'll be paying twice, and the first time, the one they paid with the present they destroyed while anticipating, is the most costly of the two, because it destroys what they actually had, rather than what they imagined they might lose. Think about this with the concreteness of something specific in your life. There's something producing anxiety in you right now, something that occupies mental space with a frequency you can verify, something that appears in moments of silence. That colors how you experience things apparently unrelated to it. That turns Sunday into a day shadowed by Monday. While that anxiety is there, what are you losing of the present? Not in the abstract, concretely. The conversation with someone who matters that you're having with half your attention because the other half is on what worries you. The meal you didn't taste, the landscape you didn't see, the moment of creative work that could have been productive and wasn't because the mind was occupied elsewhere. The rest the body needed and didn't get because the mind didn't turn off the alarm signal. That's the real price of anxiety. Not just the anticipated suffering of what might come, the destruction of the present while you wait for what might come. This week, every time you notice anxiety is present and has you living in the future, ask yourself this question: what am I losing of the present right now by being in the future? Not to punish yourself for being anxious, but to see clearly the specific, concrete price anxiety is charging in this moment. That visibility of the price, that recognition of what specifically is being lost, is one of the most direct ways to begin interrupting the cycle. Do it today and over the coming days. And there's one last thing about this second lesson the episode can't leave unsaid. Anxiety has a justification it offers when you question it, the same one fear offers, but with an additional touch that makes it harder to dismantle. Fear says, I'm protecting you from something specific. Anxiety says something more sophisticated. I'm preparing you for everything possible. And that promise of universal preparation of being ready for anything that might come is especially convincing for people who value control, planning, and responsibility, because it sounds exactly like something a responsible, serious person should do. prepare. But there's a fundamental difference between preparing and worrying that Seneca articulated with a clarity that leaves no room for confusion. Preparing involves action. You evaluate the risk with available information. You take the measures within your reach to reduce the risk or to respond if the risk materializes. And then you act on what the present moment requires. Worrying without acting is something else. It's generating the stress response without producing any action that reduces the risk or improves the position for facing what might come. It's paying the biological and emotional price of the alarm state without getting any of the benefits that state produces when followed by action. Preparation does something with what it anticipates. Anxiety only anticipates it. And the distinction between the two, though it can be hard to see from inside, is exactly what determines whether what you're experiencing is practical wisdom or unnecessary suffering. Do it today. The calculation I asked for. With the greatest honesty you can. The information that calculation produces is the foundation for all the work that follows in this episode. Before moving to the third lesson, I need to add something about the second that completes the picture we're building. There's a dimension of the price of anticipated suffering that Seneca documented with a precision that doesn't appear frequently enough in conversations about anxiety. The price isn't only emotional, it's physical. The state of permanent alert anxiety produces has a biological correlate that's completely real and verifiable. The body, living in a state of preparation for threat, maintaining chronically elevated cortisol levels, not completing the cycle of activation and return to rest because the imagined threat never resolves, that body pays a price that accumulates over time in ways that eventually become impossible to ignore. Not as weakness, as the natural consequence of a system designed for short-duration responses operating in indefinitely prolonged response mode. Seneca observed this pattern in the people around him with the clinical acuity of someone who'd spent decades observing the human condition up close. He wrote about people who aged before their time, who arrived at the end of their lives with the wear of two lives, lived one real and one imagined, when they only had the resources for one. That's not metaphor. It's a description of what chronic anticipated suffering produces in body and mind over time, and the practical implication of that is important for this episode. Working on anxiety isn't just a philosophical practice that improves the quality of subjective experience. It's a practice that protects the resources you have for living. Time, energy, the capacity for presence, mental clarity, the health of the body that sustains everything else. All those resources are finite, and chronic anxiety consumes them in a way that produces no result proportionate to what it spends. Seneca put it in a way that applies with equal exactness now as in the 1st century. Don't spend on anticipation what you need for reality. Save the energy for what actually arrives. Because when it arrives, you're going to need everything you have available, and having spent it beforehand on anticipation won't have prepared you better to face it. It will only leave you with fewer resources to do so. Do it today. The calculation, the visibility of the price, and from that visibility, the decision to start recovering what anxiety has been charging. Third Stoic lesson. While your body is here, your mind lives in an invented future, and that division is destroying you without you realizing it. There's something that happens when anxiety is present that's hard to describe from outside, but that whoever lives it recognizes immediately when hearing it with the right precision. The feeling of being divided. The body is in one place, the mind is in another. And that gap between where you are physically and where you live mentally produces a type of exhaustion that has no exact name in everyday language, but is completely real in the experience of whoever lives it. It's not just distraction. Distraction is temporary and voluntary. You can exit it when something more interesting or urgent appears. The division anxiety produces is different. It's persistent. It's involuntary. It's the feeling that no matter what's happening in front of you right now, a part of you continues living in that future where the problem that worries you resides. And that part doesn't fully return to the present, even though the present requires your complete attention. Think about when you were last completely present. Not present the way that word gets used superficially, as if it just meant not looking at your phone. Present in the real sense, completely there, completely in this moment, without that layer of diffuse worry that colors everything with the shadow of something that exists in another place in time. For many people living with chronic anxiety, that memory is hard to find because complete presence has become something infrequent. And the loss of that presence has a cost that accumulates in ways that go far beyond the anticipated suffering we already examined. Presence is the only state where you can truly connect with other people. When you're divided between the present and the anxious future, conversations happen, but without the quality of attention that makes a conversation truly a conversation. The people who matter to you speak and you respond, but from a part of you that's available, not from your full attention. And they feel it, even if they can't always name it. They feel you're there, but not completely. They feel the distance anxiety puts between you and everything else. Presence is also the only state where you can do real creative work. The kind of deep thinking, the kind of sustained attention on a problem or project that produces the most significant results in any area of work, requires the mind to be completely in the problem before it, not divided between the present problem and the anxious future running in the background, consuming cognitive resources that should be available for what's here now. Chronic anxiety has a cost in performance. Nobody calculates, but that's perfectly real. Not because the person is less capable, but because available capacity is being partially consumed by the constant processing of imaginary threats. Picture this scene. Marcus Aurelius is in his campaign tent on the Danube frontier. He has before him decisions that will affect thousands of people. He needs clarity. He needs the ability to think with the depth those decisions require. And he could be living in the future, could be building scenarios of what might go wrong in tomorrow's battle, or next year's campaign, or the empire's long-term stability. He had real reasons for that kind of anxious projection. The threats he faced were completely real, but in his meditations there's no such projection. There's presence. There's the constant question, what is the right thing to do right now? What is correct in this moment with this concrete situation? Not in the abstract future, in the concrete present. And that ability to bring attention to the present, to work with what's here now instead of what might be there later, is part of what allowed him to maintain the clarity of judgment his position required in conditions that would have clouded the mind of someone less trained in this practice. Presence isn't just a philosophical virtue. It's a real practical advantage in any context where you need to think clearly and act effectively. Anxiety deprives you of that advantage, not because you're weak, but because the nervous system has limited resources, and when a significant portion of those resources is being consumed processing imaginary threats, less remains available for what the present moment requires. Seneca understood this from his experience with time as the most valuable resource. He wrote about time with the intensity of someone who'd felt firsthand what it means to lose it. Not lose it in the sense of it running out, which is inevitable. Lose it in the sense of not using it. of having it before you and not inhabiting it, of being alive in time without being present in it. And anxiety, he wrote, is one of the most efficient ways to waste the present. Not because you don't do things while anxious. You can be doing many things while anxiety is present. Working, cooking, talking, moving through the world. But you're not completely in those things. And that fraction of presence that's missing, multiplied by the days and months and years anxiety has been present, represents an amount of unlived life that, when seen clearly, turns out to be enormous. This is your assignment for this third lesson. Today, during an activity you'd normally do with divided attention, decide to do that activity with the greatest presence you can for 10 minutes. Just 10, no more. It can be a meal, a conversation, a 10-minute walk, any everyday activity that normally passes while your mind is elsewhere. During those 10 minutes, every time you notice the mind has gone to the future, bring it back to the present. Without judging yourself for it leaving, without getting frustrated that it keeps returning, just returning, again and again. Not to solve anything, not to produce a state of perfect calm that isn't the goal of this exercise. To directly experience the difference between being divided and being present. That difference, experienced rather than just thought about, is the most useful information you can have for understanding the real price anxiety charges on the quality of your daily presence. Do it today. Fourth Stoic lesson. Marcus Aurelius governed during plagues and wars and still wrote that we should never be disturbed by what hasn't yet happened, because the present is the only thing we truly possess. There's an argument anxiety always has available when you question it. The argument says, but my worries are real. The problems I anticipate aren't invented. The things that worry me could actually happen. I'm not imagining threats that don't exist. I'm seeing real possibilities of difficulty and loss, and consequences that would be genuinely hard. And that argument has enough truth to be completely convincing from inside the anxiety. Worries frequently point toward real possibilities. But this is exactly where Marcus Aurelius's teaching proves most powerful. Because Marcus Aurelius didn't live in a world where worries were imaginary. His worries had a completely real basis. Picture this moment with all the concreteness you can. You're governing Rome. The Antonine Plague is devastating the empire. There's no way to know when it's going to end, or how many more cities it'll affect, or what percentage of the population will be lost. The future of the empire's economy, military capability, social stability, all are being threatened by something you can't directly control. At the same time, the northern frontiers are under constant pressure. There are military campaigns requiring years of attention and resources. There are decisions that will cost lives no matter which decision is made. And in that context, with worries that are genuinely serious and completely real, Marcus Aurelius writes in his Meditations something that might sound like abstract philosophy if you didn't know the context in which it was written. Never be disturbed by what has not yet happened. It's not advice for someone living in protected circumstances where nothing serious could happen. It's the practice of someone living in circumstances where very serious things are constantly happening and where the future is genuinely uncertain and potentially dark. What does that instruction mean from that context? It means exactly this. The suffering that corresponds to what hasn't yet happened, if it happens, will be paid when it happens. Facing it now, before it's arrived, doesn't resolve it. It only doubles the price. You pay the anticipated suffering now, with nothing changing as a result of that suffering. And then, if the difficult event comes, you pay the real suffering too. Nothing you do now, in terms of worry, and anxiety about the future changes what's going to happen in that future. It only changes the quality of the present you have now, for the worse. Marcus Aurelius understood this from a practice of years, not from theory. In his meditations, there's a structure that repeats, what's in my control right now? What action is right to take now? How do I want to respond to what I have in front of me in this moment? Not, what might happen tomorrow? What should I do if this or that occurs? How am I going to manage the 10 possible scenarios of the future? Marcus Aurelius's attention was on the present, not because the future didn't exist or because the worries weren't real, but because he understood that the only place where action is possible is the present, and that spending attention on the future, even a future about which he had genuine concerns, was spending the only currency available for action in a place where it could produce no change. Attention on the present produces possible action. Attention on the future produces only anticipated suffering. Seneca added something that makes this even more concrete. He wrote that most of the time we're not victims of the present, but of the past and the future. That the present is rarely as unbearable as what we make of it, when we add the weight of the past we can't change and the weight of the future that doesn't yet exist. The present, clean of those additions, is frequently manageable. It's the additions that make it unbearable. And anxiety is exactly that process of adding to the present the weight of a future that doesn't yet exist, and that when it arrives will no longer be the future, but the present, which you'll face then with the resources you have then. This is your assignment for this 4th lesson. Identify the worry consuming the most energy right now, the most present one, the one that appears most frequently, and ask yourself this question in 2 parts. First part, is there something I can do right now, in the present, that reduces the risk or prepares me better for what I fear? If the answer is yes, do it. That's preparation, that's prudence, that's using worry productively. If the answer is no, if there's no action available in the present that changes what worries you about the future, ask yourself the second part. Second part, if I can't do anything right now about this, what price am I paying by continuing to worry? The answer to that second part, seen clearly, is the information you need to start releasing what you can't change. Not easily, not all at once, but clarity about the price is the starting point. Do it today. 5th Stoic lesson. Anxiety steals the only moment you have to be happy, which is this one, while making you pay for misfortunes you'll probably never collect on. This lesson says something that may sound simple, but that, when fully received, changes your relationship with time. The only moment where you can be happy is the present, not the future. The future doesn't exist yet. When it arrives, it will be the present, and if you spend it worried about what comes next, it will still not be the moment you fully inhabit. Not the past. The past no longer exists anywhere you can reach to modify it. It exists only as memory, and though memories have their value, living in them isn't living. The present, this moment, this is the only window where life actually happens. Where a conversation is a real conversation and not just words exchanged while the mind is elsewhere. Where a meal has real taste, where a relationship has real presence, where work has real meaning, where what matters is accessible in a way it isn't in any other time, and anxiety steals it from you, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, silently, eating away the edges of each present moment until what remains is a thinned-out version of what it could be if you were completely in it. There's a tax anxiety charges that nobody names exactly as a tax, but that functions exactly as one. It makes you pay for misfortunes you'll probably never have to pay for. Think of this as a financial transaction. There's a possible future event you fear. It has some probability of occurring. It might be high, or it might be low, but it has uncertainty, because everything that hasn't happened yet has uncertainty. Anxiety makes you pay the price of that event, even though it hasn't happened yet. It charges you the anticipated suffering now, immediately, without waiting to verify whether the event will materialize. If the event happens, you'll have paid twice, once in anticipation and once in reality. If the event doesn't happen, you'll have paid once for something that never existed. In neither scenario is there a good outcome for you. But especially in the second, where you pay the price of something that never comes, the transaction turns out to be completely absurd when seen clearly. Why do we keep making that transaction then? Because anxiety doesn't present itself as what it is. It presents itself as responsibility, as caution, as the behavior of someone who takes things seriously, and those presentations have enough credibility that the transaction seems reasonable in the moment it occurs. Marcus Aurelius had a way of seeing this that was nothing abstract. In his meditations, he repeatedly asks, what is actually disturbing in a situation, not what seems to disturb. What's really disturbing if you examine it honestly? And in most cases what he finds is that what disturbs isn't the situation itself. It's the judgment he makes about the situation, the story he builds about what the situation means for the future. The situation itself, seen without the additions the mind makes, is frequently more manageable than it seems from inside the anxious narrative surrounding it. Not always. Some situations are genuinely difficult without additions. But most of the time the situation plus the anxious story about the situation is much heavier than the situation alone. Epictetus put it with a directness that leaves no room for ambiguity. If something is under your control, act on it. If it's not under your control, releasing it isn't weakness or indifference. It's the only rational response to something you can't change. Anxiety about what you can't control doesn't change the outcome. It only destroys the present you have. And destroying it doesn't make you more prepared for what might come. It only makes you less able to be fully in what you already have. This is your assignment for this 5th lesson. During one moment today, a specific moment you deliberately choose, decide to be completely happy. Not because everything is perfect, or because there's nothing worrying you, but because this moment is the only one you have, and it contains within it everything necessary to be fully inhabited, not as an exercise in denying existing problems, as a conscious decision that the present has its own value that doesn't depend on the future being exactly what you want it to be. That value, that possibility of complete presence in this moment regardless of what comes after, is exactly what anxiety steals from you every time it pulls you out of the now. Do it today. Reclaim it, one moment at a time. There's more this 5th lesson needs to say about happiness and the present before continuing, because there's a frequent confusion about what living in the present means that makes it seem, at first glance, like something only possible for people who don't have real problems. The confusion sounds like this: living in the present is easy when everything's fine. But when there are real problems, when there's genuine uncertainty about things that matter, the present isn't exactly a place you want to stay, because the present is exactly where those problems are. That confusion mixes two things that are different. Living in the present doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist. It doesn't mean ignoring the real difficulties that are there. It doesn't mean cultivating forced optimism that denies the reality of what's difficult. It means something more precise. It means facing what's in front of you now, in this moment, with the resources you have now, without adding the weight of the future that doesn't yet exist, without multiplying the weight of the present with the imagined weight of everything that might be added to what already is. The present with all its real problems is manageable in a way that the present plus the imagined future of all possible problems is not. Seneca lived this in exile. The exile was real. The difficulties were real. The distance from everything he valued was real. But what Seneca discovered in that exile is that the present of exile, with everything difficult in it, was manageable when faced directly. What was not manageable was the exile plus everything the exile might mean for the future, plus all the ways it might get worse, plus all the possibilities that it might never end. The imagined accumulation was heavier than the present reality. It always is. Marcus Aurelius practiced it in conditions that were nothing easy, governing during plagues, wars, betrayals, with real losses, with genuine uncertainty about things that mattered enormously. And what allowed him to function with the effectiveness his position required was exactly this ability to stay in the present, to work with what was before him now instead of what might be there tomorrow. To not add to the real present the weight of the imagined future, not as a practice achieved once, as something actively and constantly worked on, returning, always returning, to the present, to the only place where life actually happens, and where happiness, not perfect happiness, but real, nuanced, genuine happiness is possible even amid the difficulties the present contains. This week, once a day, return to the present deliberately, not when anxiety has disappeared. While anxiety is there, return anyway. That's the training. Before closing this block of lessons, I need to add something about lessons 3, 4, and 5 that connects them in a way that makes the pattern we're describing more visible. All 3 lessons, the division between body and mind, not being disturbed by what hasn't happened, and anxiety as theft of the present, point toward the same fundamental truth from 3 different angles. The life you have happens here, not there. Not in the future where anxiety lives. Not in the scenarios your mind builds about what could happen. Not in the endless calculations about the probabilities of disasters that may never materialize. Here, in this moment, with this person, with this work, with this meal, with this sky, with this conversation, with this rest, with everything that exists right now in the space of your real life. And the question Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus answered from completely different circumstances is the same. What are you doing with what you have now? Not with what you might have if the future were different. With what you have now. Not with what you'd have if the problems you anticipate didn't exist. With what you have now, those problems included. That question, asked from honesty and answered with action, is the most powerful antidote that exists against anxiety. Because anxiety lives in the future, and that question lives in the present. Every time you ask it, you're choosing the present over the anxious future. And that choice, repeated enough times, is exactly the work that transforms your relationship with anxiety. Not dramatically or all at once, but gradually, consistently, until the present becomes the place where you live more than the imagined future. The 3 lessons in this block gave you 3 ways to make that choice. Use them, all 3, today. And there's something lessons 3, 4, and 5 have in common that's worth naming directly because it makes the way out more visible. All 3 speak of attention as a resource. Your attention is finite. It can't be completely in the present and completely in the future at the same time. When anxiety steals it toward the future, less is available for the present. And when less is available for the present, the quality of what you live in the present decreases proportionally. This has a practical implication Epictetus taught with a clarity his students could verify directly in their own experience. Paying attention to the present isn't just a spiritual exercise. It's the most basic management of your most valuable resource. Every time anxiety takes you to the future, you lose some of the attention that could be producing something real in the present. Lose some presence with the people who matter, some depth in work, some quality in rest, some of the experience of being alive in this specific moment that won't repeat in the same form. And those small losses, accumulated over time, represent an amount of unlived life that, when honestly calculated, turns out to be one of the most costly things anxiety produces. Seneca had a practice that addressed this directly. At the end of each day, he asked himself what he'd done with that day's time, not in terms of productivity alone, in terms of presence. Had he been completely there at any point? Had he genuinely connected with something or someone? Had he lived that day, or simply passed through it while his mind was elsewhere? That question, asked honestly at the end of the day, produces information few things can produce. The visibility of what anxiety specifically costs today, not in the abstract. Concretely, this conversation that happened with divided attention, this work done below its potential because the mind was partially elsewhere, this moment of connection that could have been deeper and wasn't because worry about tomorrow was there. That visibility, accumulated day by day, is what eventually makes the work of returning to the present not just an abstract philosophical practice, but something your own experience tells you is worth doing. Do it tonight. At the end of today, honestly ask yourself, how much of the day did I live completely in the present? And how much did I spend in the future where anxiety lives? Not to judge yourself, to see clearly. What's seen clearly can be worked on. What remains invisible keeps operating without you being able to do anything about it. Do it today. Before closing the second block of lessons, there's something about lessons 4 and 5 that needs to be said together, because they reinforce each other in a way that makes each more powerful. Lesson 4 says, the present is the only thing we truly possess. Lesson 5 says the present is the only moment where happiness is possible. Together they say something that goes beyond either one separately, that what you have and what you seek are in the same place. That sounds simple, perhaps too simple to be taken completely seriously, but it has a depth that only appears when you examine it with the attention it deserves. Most of the time we live as if what we seek were in the future. Happiness, peace, genuine rest, the feeling that things are okay, we locate all of that in the future. When the problems are resolved, when the uncertainty has been reduced to a manageable level, when circumstances are more favorable, when there's less of what worries me and more of what I want. And meanwhile, the present passes as the territory you have to cross to reach the future, where those things will be available. But that future never arrives as the place where everything is finally resolved. There's always something new to resolve, always something new to fear, always new uncertainty about things that matter. And if the condition for happiness is the absence of those things, then happiness remains forever in the future, always one step ahead, always behind the next resolution of the next problem. Marcus Aurelius understood this in a way that makes it impossible to ignore when seen from his perspective. He had access to more material resources than virtually any human being in history. He had power, wealth, influence, all the elements most people associate with the possibility of happiness. And he lived for decades in the most demanding, difficult conditions that power imposed on him. And what he wrote in his meditations was not about waiting for circumstances to improve in order to live well. It was about living well in the circumstances he had. Now, with the plague, with the wars, with the losses, with the permanent uncertainty about everything that could change, the well-lived life didn't wait for a better future. It happened in the difficult present. That's not resignation. It's the deepest understanding that exists about where life lives. In the present. Always in the present. With everything the present contains, including what's difficult. And that recognition, that decision to live in the present you have, instead of waiting for the future you desire, is the foundation of everything the Stoics taught about inner freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, freedom within them. That freedom is available now, regardless of what anxiety is building in the background. Go there, right now. Sixth Stoic lesson. Epictetus taught the distinction between what depends on us and what doesn't, and anxiety is born precisely from obsessing over what you can't control. This is the most powerful of the 10 lessons for working with anxiety at the root. Not from the symptoms, not from the manifestations, from the fundamental cause that produces the anxious state in the first place. Epictetus called it the dichotomy of control. And it's simple in its formulation, though it requires sustained practice to fully internalize in the way that changes daily experience. There are 2 categories of things in the world, those that depend on you, and those that don't depend on you. In the first category, what depends on you, Epictetus included your judgments, your impulses, your desires, your actions, your response to what happens. Everything your will can directly determine. Everything that is, in the deepest sense, in your domain. In the second category, what doesn't depend on you, he included the body, reputation, positions, wealth, the outcome of your actions, what others think and do. External circumstances the world produces regardless of what you choose. Anxiety, Epictetus taught, is born from confusing those 2 categories. From treating what's in the second category, what doesn't depend on you, as if it were in the first. From spending attention and energy trying to control what can't be controlled. From worrying with the same intensity or more about the outcome you don't control as about the action you do control. And that confusion produces exactly the state you experience as anxiety. The feeling that there's something threatening that should be solvable, but that you can't fully solve. The feeling that if you just thought about it more, or analyzed it better, or found the right strategy, you could finally control what actually isn't within your control. That feeling is the engine of chronic anxiety. Picture this scene. You're at Epictetus's school. It's the 1st century AD in Nicopolis. There's a student who's been consumed for weeks by anxiety about the outcome of something important in his life. It could be his position, a relationship, some matter about which he has real uncertainty. Epictetus listens, and then asks him the question that is the heart of his entire philosophy. What of what worries you is in your control? Not abstractly, concretely. What specifically can you change with your action? And the student begins to enumerate the process of separating what he can change from what he can't, what depends on him from what depends on others, on circumstances, on the world. And what he discovers in that process, what everyone who does this exercise honestly discovers, is that most of the things his anxiety was spending energy on were not in his control. The outcome wasn't in his control, only the quality of his effort. Others' reactions weren't in his control, only how he communicated. The future wasn't in his control, only what he did now. And when that separation is clear, When you can see precisely what's on one side and what's on the other, anxiety loses a significant part of its foundation. Because anxiety about what you can't control doesn't change the outcome. It only destroys your presence and your capacity in the present. While attention on what you can control, on the action available to you, now produces something real, produces movement, produces the possibility of influencing the outcome, even if not determining it completely. There's a crucial distinction Epictetus always added when teaching this. Distinguishing between what depends on you and what doesn't mean indifference toward the outcome. You can care deeply about the outcome, can desire it intensely, can work with all the dedication you have toward it. But if you understand the outcome is in the second category, what doesn't completely depend on you, then your relationship with the uncertainty about that outcome changes. Not because you don't care, but because you understand. The energy you spend anguishing over the outcome doesn't change the outcome. It only changes your capacity to do the work that influences it. Seneca put it in a way that's simultaneously honest and liberating. Do the best you can with what you have, and then take the rest as it comes. Not as passive resignation before everything that might happen, as the practical recognition that there's a line between what depends on you and what doesn't. And that living well means acting with all available energy on the side that depends on you and releasing, to the extent possible, the side that doesn't. Marcus Aurelius practiced it in the conditions we already know. As a ruler during decades of crises, no human would have voluntarily chosen. He learned to distinguish clearly between what corresponded to his action and what was beyond his reach. Not because he didn't care about what was beyond his reach. The lives depending on his decisions mattered deeply. The empire's stability mattered. His family's health mattered. But he understood that spending energy anguishing over results he couldn't fully control was spending it in exactly the place where it produced least, and that spending it on the quality of action, on clarity of judgment, on the coherence of the principles guiding his decisions, was spending it where it produced most. That clarity about where to put energy is one of the most powerful sources of calm that exists. Not the calm of someone without problems. The calm of someone who knows exactly what deserves their attention and what doesn't. This is your assignment for this 6th lesson. Take the worry consuming the most energy right now and divide it into 2 columns. In the first column, write everything in that situation that depends on you, the actions you can take, the decisions you can make, the quality of effort you can put in, how you communicate, what depends on your will. In the second column, write everything that doesn't depend on you, the final outcome, others' reactions, circumstances the world produces, what's outside your direct control. Then ask yourself this question about the first column. Am I doing everything that's in my control? If the answer is yes, you've done what depends on you. The rest doesn't deserve more energy than it already has. If the answer is no, there's the work. Not in anguishing over the second column, in acting on the first. Do it today. 7th Stoic lesson. Your anxious mind believes that worrying is preparing, but worrying without acting is just suffering twice for something that may never happen. This lesson directly attacks the most convincing justification anxiety has for continuing to operate. The justification of preparation. Your anxious mind doesn't present itself as a source of unnecessary suffering. It presents itself as a sophisticated preparation system. It tells you that by thinking about all possible scenarios, by exploring every way something could go wrong, by maintaining permanent alert about potential threats, you're being responsible. Being someone who takes things seriously. doing exactly what an intelligent, cautious person should do. And that presentation is convincing enough that you accept it without examining it too closely. Until you examine it. And when you examine it with the honesty it deserves, you find something that wasn't in the presentation. Most anxious worrying doesn't produce action. It produces thought, produces analysis, produces more worry, produces variations on the same scenarios revisited from slightly different angles, produces the feeling of actively working on the problem, when in reality, you're only generating the alarm state that accompanies thinking about the problem without advancing toward any real solution. The difference between worry that prepares and worry that only suffers is exactly this. Worry that prepares ends in concrete action. You evaluate the risk, identify what you can do about it, take the available action, and then let go of what you can't change. The cycle has closure. The energy invested produces something real. Worry that only suffers doesn't end in action. You evaluate the risk, build scenarios, revisit them, expand them, re-examine them, look for more information confirming or refuting your worst fears, and the cycle doesn't close because there's no action to close it. Energy is invested without producing anything that reduces the risk or improves the position for what might come. Seneca saw this with absolute clarity. He wrote that there's a difference between thought that resolves and thought that ruminates. The first advances. The second circles the same problem without producing real movement. And anxiety is, for the most part, thought that ruminates. Not because the person experiencing it is incapable of thinking effectively, but because the alarm state anxiety produces activates a thinking mode designed to search for threats, not to solve problems. And that thinking mode, useful in small doses when there's a specific threat to evaluate, becomes counterproductive when maintained chronically about diffuse, undefined threats. Marcus Aurelius understood this from his practice of governance. There's a difference between thinking about the problem and acting on the problem. Thought is preparation for action. When it becomes a substitute for action, it loses its function. And in many cases, especially with chronic anxiety, thought becomes exactly that substitute. The person feels they're doing something by worrying, analyzing, exploring scenarios. But what they're doing doesn't change the reality that worries them. It only produces the suffering of the alarm state without the benefit of action that could improve the situation. Epictetus had a question that dissolves this confusion with a speed that can be uncomfortable. The question is, what are you doing with this? Not, what are you thinking about this? What are you doing? If the answer is a concrete action, something that changes the situation or improves the position for facing it, that's preparation. If the answer is more thought about the same scenarios without any action modifying them, that's not preparation. It's anticipated suffering disguised as preparation. And that distinction, seen clearly, changes how you evaluate what your anxious mind is producing in each moment. This is your assignment for this 7th lesson. The next time you find yourself in a worry cycle about something, ask yourself Epictetus's question. What am I doing with this? If there's a concrete action available that reduces the risk or improves the position, take it now. Don't analyze it more. Take it. If there's no concrete action available right now, recognize that what you're doing isn't preparation. And from that recognition, choose to return to the present. Not easily, not without the mind trying to return to the cycle, but with the clarity that staying in the cycle isn't producing anything useful. Every time the mind returns to the cycle without available action, the question is the same. What am I doing with this? Do it today with the next worry that appears. There's more about this seventh lesson that deserves development with the depth it requires, because this is where the distinction between real preparation and unproductive worry is most easily lost. Preparation has a quality that distinguishes it from anxious worry beyond whether it ends in action. Preparation produces clarity. When you genuinely prepare for something, when you evaluate risk with real information and take available actions and consider possible contingencies, the process produces a feeling of clarity, of having done what could be done, of being in the most solid position possible given the circumstances. Anxious worry produces the opposite. The more time you spend in the anxious cycle without action, the darker and more unmanageable the problem seems. Disaster scenarios don't diminish with more review. They grow, expand. Connect to other disaster scenarios that generate their own ramifications. If what you're doing with your worry produces clarity, it's preparation. If it produces more darkness and more complexity than the original scenario, it's anxiety. Seneca observed this pattern in himself and those around him for decades. He wrote about the mind that becomes its own enemy, that takes manageable problems and amplifies them until they seem insurmountable. Not because the problems are genuinely insurmountable, but because the mental process examining them has a catastrophic bias that amplifies rather than clarifies. And the signal that this process has taken over is exactly this. The problem seems larger after more deliberation, not smaller. If thinking more about something makes it appear more unmanageable, you're not thinking productively about it. You're feeding the anxiety. And at that point, the best response isn't to keep thinking more or differently. It's to stop. Return to the present. Do what depends on you with what you have now, and let go of what doesn't depend on you. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with the discipline of someone who understands that mental clarity isn't a state that simply appears. It's the result of actively directing attention toward what produces clarity and away from what produces darkness. And that active direction of attention is exactly what the Stoic practice of returning to the present is training. Not the elimination of worry, the ability to recognize when worry has crossed from preparation into unproductive anxiety, and from that recognition, choosing action or the present instead of the endless cycle. Eighth Stoic lesson. The Stoics practiced returning to the present again and again because they understood that life only happens now, never in the future, that anguishes you so much. There's something about the Stoic practice of returning to the present that needs to be understood correctly before it can be useful. It's not a state you reach once and that then remains. It's a practice that repeats again and again, indefinitely. The human mind, especially a mind with the habit of anxiety built over years, doesn't stay in the present because it's asked once. It goes back to the future, back to the worry scenarios, back to the thought cycles that have been operating for months or years with the automaticity of a deeply established habit. And that's not failure. It's the nature of the work. The Stoics didn't practice presence as something definitively achieved at some point along the path after enough practice and inner work. They practiced it as something you do now, and then do again, and then do again, infinitely. Not because they weren't advancing, but because the practice itself, the act of returning, is the advancement. Picture this scene. Marcus Aurelius is in his campaign tent before the day begins. He's slept poorly. The mind is already active about the problems the day will bring, and the next days and next weeks. The weight of governance, of wars, of accumulating decisions is already there before the day starts. What does he do? He opens the journal. He writes, Not about the future that worries him, about who he wants to be today, about the principles he wants guiding his decisions today, about what needs to be done with what he has before him today. He doesn't eliminate the worry, he redirects it, takes it from the uncontrollable future to the present where action is possible. And he does it every day. Not just when anxiety is intense, not just in crisis moments, every day, as constant, invariable practice, because he understood something only direct practice can teach. The mind doesn't stay in the present without active work, especially a mind that's lived under constant pressure for years. That mind has deep habits of projecting into the future that don't dissolve with a single exercise or a single decision to be present. They're worked on, constantly, with the humility of someone who knows the work doesn't end, and with the consistency of someone who understands that's not a reason not to do it. Seneca practiced something similar at the end of each day. The daily review we briefly described before, not just as an evaluation exercise, but as a practice of retrospective presence, seeing the day with clarity, recognizing where he was completely present and where not, recognizing when he deliberately returned to the present and when the anxious future took over without his noticing. That review isn't to produce guilt. It's to sharpen awareness, to become more skilled at noticing when the mind has gone and at choosing to return, because noticing is always the first step. You can't return to the present from a place you don't know you left. The awareness that the mind went to the future, that pause of recognition before returning, is itself a form of presence. It's the instant where you choose, instead of simply flowing with habit. Epictetus taught this with an image his students found useful for its concreteness. He said the mind is like a domesticated animal that tends to return to its habits, not because it's bad, because that's its nature. And the trainer's job isn't to eliminate the animal's nature, but to work with it, to recognize it when it appears, to patiently redirect it, without anger at the animal for being what it is, without frustration because it returns to its habit, with the equanimity of someone who understands that this is the work. Returning, always returning. This is your assignment for this 8th lesson. For the next 7 days, choose a specific moment in your daily routine to deliberately practice returning to the present. Not when it's convenient, a fixed moment, the same one each day. It can be the first 10 minutes of morning, before checking your phone, before the day starts building its momentum. It can be during a meal. It can be the time between work and home, that transitional space that exists in many lives. During that moment, when you notice the mind has gone to the future, bring it back, without judging that it left, without frustration that it keeps returning to the future, just returning, again and again, for 7 days. Not to definitively resolve anxiety in 7 days, to establish the habit of practice that eventually, with enough repetition, makes the present more accessible. Start today. 9th Stoic lesson. Every minute you spend anxious about tomorrow is a minute you steal from today, and in the end, you'll discover you missed your entire life waiting for something bad to happen. This lesson has the form of a warning, not to produce fear about the future, which would be counterproductive given this episode's topic, to produce clarity about what's at stake when chronic anxiety isn't worked on. There are people who, upon reaching the end of their lives, in that moment of retrospective looking that proximity to the end makes possible, discover something that, from inside active life, was hard to see with the same clarity. That they spent most of their life in the future, waiting for something bad to happen, preparing for disasters that rarely arrived with the magnitude they anticipated. Living in the state of permanent alert anxiety produces, and that meanwhile the present past, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, day by day, moment by moment, until the sum of all those incompletely lived presents represents an entire life that happened in the margins of attention, while the main attention was on the anxious future. That's not fatalism, it's information about what's at stake. Seneca wrote it with the urgency of someone who'd reached that backward-looking perspective and who wanted Lucilius, who still had most of his life ahead, to understand what was at stake before it was the backward look that revealed it. Time that's already passed can't be recovered. Time that's passing right now can be inhabited, but only if you decide to inhabit it. Not the future's time, not when anxiety has disappeared, or when the problems worrying you have been solved, or when circumstances are more favorable for being completely present. Now, with the problems that exist, with the uncertainty that exists, with the anxiety that exists, regardless. Marcus Aurelius understood this with the perspective of someone who governed for decades under the constant pressure of circumstances that justified chronic anxiety. And yet, in his meditations, what most clearly appears is the choice to be present. Not as something he achieved once and then simply maintained, as something he chose anew each day, with all the pressure on him, with all the reasons to be in the future his position gave him. He chose the present anyway, not because the future didn't matter, because he understood the present was the only place where he could do something real with what mattered. This is your assignment for this 9th lesson. Think of a moment in your recent life when you were completely present. Not many moments. One. The one you remember most clearly. What was that experience like compared to moments where anxiety was present? What was available in that moment that wasn't available when anxiety occupied the space? That difference that contrasts your own experience gives you is the most convincing information about why the work of returning to the present is worth doing. Not because someone tells you, because you yourself know it from the inside. Do it today. There's more about the 9th lesson that deserves development before closing this block. Because the warning that you might reach the end of your life, having spent most of it in the anxious future, has a dimension that's important to name with the honesty it deserves. It's not hyperbole. It's what actually happens when chronic anxiety isn't worked on for years. Not in all cases with the same intensity. There are gradations. There are people who live with moderate anxiety that tints the edges of experience but doesn't devour it completely. And there are people where anxiety is so intense and so constant that entire life happens within its shadow. But in both cases, the pattern is the same. The present is the place where life happens. And anxiety is the mechanism that pulls you out of the present. Every time it pulls you out, you lose a fraction of what that moment had available. Every time you return, you recover a fraction. And the sum of all those departures and all those returns, over days and months and years, determines how much of your life you lived completely. Seneca had an image for this that has been exactly precise for 20 centuries. He wrote that many people are too busy to live, that they spend so much time on the activities of preparing for life, the planning, the worrying, the managing of what might come, that life itself passes as something that happens in the margins of all that. Anxiety is the most extreme version of that pattern. The most extreme because it doesn't only occupy time, it occupies attention. And attention is the currency with which experience is purchased. Without it, experience impoverishes, even when all external conditions are favorable. With it, even difficult circumstances have a quality of presence that makes them completely different to live than the same circumstances without attention. Epictetus lived this from the clearest possible extreme. In conditions that would have justified his attention being completely on suffering and fear and anticipation of what might come, he chose to be present in what he had. Not because his circumstances were good, but because he understood the quality of his experience didn't depend on circumstances. It depended on where he put his attention. And that understanding lived from inside the most adverse conditions a human being could face in the ancient world is the most powerful evidence that exists that the present is always accessible, regardless of what's happening outside. Regardless of what anxiety is building in the mind, the present is always there, and it's always possible to return to it. One more time, and then again, and then again. That's the work, and it's worth doing, right now. Before closing the third block, there's something about lessons 6, 7, 8, and 9 that connects them in a way that makes the path we're describing more visible. All 4 lessons in this block speak of the same thing from 4 different angles. Anxiety is the result of putting attention in the wrong place. Lesson 6 says, attention is on what you don't control when it should be on what you do control. Lesson 7 says, attention is on thinking about the problem when it should be on acting on it. Lesson 8 says, attention is on the future when it should be on the present. And Lesson 9 says, the attention you give to the anxious tomorrow is attention you steal from the today you have. 4 ways of saying the same thing. Misdirected attention produces anxiety. Well-directed attention produces action, presence, and the possibility of living what you have instead of consuming it, anticipating what might come. And if the cause of anxiety is misdirected attention, then the main tool for working with it isn't eliminating anxious thoughts, which is impossible, but redirecting attention constantly and deliberately toward the right place. Which is exactly what the 10th lesson gives you as practice, not as a definitive solution, as constant training of attention. Epictetus summed it up with a clarity that has been the most precise description of the work for 2,000 years. Guard what you give your mind, not because the mind is dangerous, but because what habitually inhabits your mind determines the quality of your experience of being alive. A mind that habitually lives in the anxious future has a fundamentally different experience of life than a mind that habitually lives in the active present. Not because circumstances are different, because the experience of the same circumstances is different depending on where attention lives. That's what this episode is leaving you. Not the promise that if you practice enough, anxiety will completely disappear. The understanding that you have more influence over your experience than anxiety allows you to see, and the tool to exercise that influence. Once, and then again, and then again. Always returning, always here. 10th Stoic lesson. Today, you're going to practice one single thing. Every time your mind goes to the future, you're going to bring it back to the present and ask yourself what you can do right now with what you have. This is the lesson that converts everything before it into something you can use today, not tomorrow. Not when you've fully processed everything you saw in this episode. Not when you've practiced enough to feel ready. Today, with what you have right now. In the circumstances you have right now, with the anxiety you have right now. Regardless, the 9 previous lessons built the complete foundation for understanding anxiety from its roots. You saw what it is, how it works, why it charges the price it charges, where it comes from, what promises it makes and doesn't keep, what central tool the Stoics developed to work with it from the fundamental cause rather than from symptoms. All of that is the map. This lesson is the first step into the territory. The tool is simple, so simple it may seem insufficient for the complexity of what we're trying to work with. But simplicity isn't a defect. It's exactly what makes it applicable in the moments where it's most needed, which are precisely the moments where the anxious mind is most active and where something complicated would be impossible to implement. The tool has two parts. The first part, noticing when the mind has gone to the future. This is harder than it sounds, because a mind in the anxious future frequently doesn't announce it. It's simply there, and the person is functioning, responding, moving through the world, but from that divided state we already described. One part present, one part in the anxious future. The first step is developing the ability to notice that state when it's happening, not to judge it, not to get frustrated that it's happening again, just to notice it. I'm in the anxious future right now. That recognition, that pause of awareness, is itself an act of presence. It's the instant where the automaticity of the anxious habit is briefly interrupted, where there's a choice. The second part, bringing the mind to the present by asking yourself what you can do right now with what you have. This question has a very specific structure that's important to maintain. Not what you should eventually do, not what you should have done before, not what you'd do if circumstances were different. What you can do right now, with what you have, in this moment. The question is concrete, it's actionable, and most importantly, it's completely present. It can't be answered from the future. It can only be answered from the present, and when you try to answer it, the mind has to return to the present to find the answer. That's exactly the mechanism of the tool, not the elimination of anxiety, the redirection of attention from the future to the present through a question that can only be answered from the present. If the answer to the question reveals a concrete action available right now, take it. That's what needs to happen. Act on what you can change with what you have now. If the answer is that there's no concrete action available right now with what you have, then what's called for is exactly what the Stoics taught about what doesn't depend on you. Release it. Not permanently. Not with the certainty it will never return. For now, with the understanding that staying in the anxious cycle about something with no available action produces no useful result. It only destroys the present you have. Seneca practiced something functionally similar, though, with different words. When something worried him, he asked himself two questions in sequence. Can I do something about this? If yes, he did it. If no, he let it go. Not the sophisticated formulation of a philosopher in the abstract, the everyday practice of someone who understood that suffering over what you can't change has no utility and carries a high price. Marcus Aurelius practiced it in the most demanding conditions possible. In his campaign tent, before each day began, the structure of his meditations follows a pattern that reflects exactly this. What needs to be done today? What's in front of me now? What's the action that corresponds to this moment? Not the scenarios of everything that might go wrong in the future. The action that corresponds to this present. And that direction of attention, day after day, in conditions that would have justified chronic anxiety in any human being, is what allowed him to maintain the clarity and effectiveness his position required. Epictetus taught it with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. Distinguish what's in your control. Act on it. Release what's not in your control. That's the complete instruction. It doesn't require more elaboration than that. It requires practice. Requires enough repetition for it to become the first move when anxiety appears, instead of the cycle. That's the first move now. And that practice starts today, with the first time you notice your mind has gone to the anxious future. In that moment, the tool is, What can I do right now with what I have? If there's action available, act. If there's no action available, return to the present. That's all. That's enough to start. And starting is the only thing that matters right now. We've reached the end of this episode. The fifth of Master Your Mind. The one that marks the beginning of the second block of this series. The first 4 episodes built the awakening. They showed you the emotional forces that have governed your life with more power than you may have fully recognized. Automatic reaction, emotional slavery, anger that destroys outward, fear that paralyzes inward. And today, anxiety, the fear that doesn't rest, the state of permanent alert about a future that doesn't yet exist. Let's walk through today's 10 lessons. The first showed you what anxiety exactly is. Not ordinary fear with a clear object, but the diffuse state of permanent alert against enemies with no defined shape. The alarm signal that activates without a real threat to resolve, and that therefore never finds resolution. The second showed you the specific price of anticipated suffering, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That you've been paying taxes on misfortunes you'll probably never face the way your anxious mind anticipates. The third showed you the division between the body that's here and the mind that lives elsewhere, and what that division costs in quality of presence, in depth of connection, in real performance, in everything that matters. The fourth showed you that Marcus Aurelius, with completely real reasons for anxiety, chose the practice of not being disturbed by what hasn't yet happened. That the present is the only thing we truly possess. That the future, when it arrives, will no longer be the future. The fifth showed you that anxiety steals the only moment where real happiness is possible. This one, while charging you in advance for misfortunes you'll probably never collect on the way you fear. The sixth gave you Epictetus's central tool, the distinction between what depends on you and what doesn't, and the understanding that anxiety is born from spending energy on the second category instead of the first. The seventh dismantled anxiety's most convincing justification, the illusion that worrying is preparing. The real distinction between worry that ends in action and worry that only suffers without producing anything. The eighth showed you that returning to the present is a practice that repeats indefinitely, not a state achieved once, that the work is constant return, and that each return is itself the advancement. The ninth gave you the clearest perspective on what's at stake, the minutes stolen from today, the life lived in the margins of the present while attention is on the anxious future, and the real possibility of changing that equation. And the 10th, the one that closes this episode, gave you the simplest and most powerful tool available. When the mind goes to the future, bring it to the present by asking what you can do right now with what you have. If there's action, act. If there's no action, release. Return. Always return. The phrase you carry from this episode is the one that opened everything you heard today. The present is the only thing I truly have. Every time anxiety takes you to the future, every time it starts charging you the tax on misfortunes that may never arrive, every time the state of permanent alert starts consuming the present you have, the present is the only thing I truly have. And in the present, the only question that matters is what you can do right now with what you have. The next episode takes you to the second practical instrument of this series, silence. If anxiety is the noise your mind produces when you don't direct it, silence is its most powerful antidote. Not passive silence, silence as an active tool of power. The way the wisest men in history used silence to multiply their presence, their clarity, and their influence in the world. The next episode is called Silence Isn't Emptiness, It's Power. This is Stoicism for Winners. This is Master Your Mind. Before that next episode arrives, there's something that needs to be said about everything you saw today that makes it more real. The anxiety we described in this episode isn't a character weakness. It's not the sign of someone who doesn't have enough inner strength or enough mental discipline or enough philosophical understanding to simply stop worrying. It's the response of a nervous system designed for a world of physical, immediate threats, operating in a world where threats are primarily abstract and future, and where the system doesn't have the resolution mechanism it needs to complete the cycle and return to balance. That doesn't make you defective. It makes you human. And what Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus discovered wasn't a way to eliminate that human condition. It was a way to work with it so that it produces less unnecessary suffering and more capacity to be present in the life you actually have. They didn't promise the work would be easy. Marcus Aurelius practiced for decades in the most demanding conditions possible. Epictetus built his understanding in the most adverse conditions imaginable. Seneca developed it over an entire lifetime of direct observation that included exile, loss, and constant proximity to real danger. All three did the work, not because it was easy, because they understood the cost of not doing it was the loss of the only time they had, the present. And that recognition, that clarity about what's at stake, is what gave them the motivation to keep returning, again and again. Regardless of how many times the mind had gone to the future before that return, that same thing is available to you. Not when you've solved all your problems, not when circumstances are more favorable, not when anxiety has dropped to a more manageable level on its own. Now, with everything happening now, with all the uncertainty that exists now, with all the anxiety that exists now, the present is still there. It's always there. It's always possible to return to it. And that return, even if brief, even if it lasts only a few seconds before the mind goes back to the anxious future, is real. It's life lived. It's exactly the opposite of life passing in the margins while attention is elsewhere. Do it now. The question I brought you back with is the same one you carry with you. What can you do right now with what you have? Answer it from the present. Act on what depends on you. Release what doesn't depend on you. Return. Always return. This is Stoicism for Winners. This is Master Your Mind. There's something more the closing of this episode needs to say about the practice you carry with you. The tool of asking yourself what you can do right now with what you have is more powerful than it seems at first glance, for a reason that deserves full explanation. Anxiety operates from uncertainty. Its natural state is uncertainty about something that might happen in the future, and uncertainty is exactly the fuel that keeps the anxious cycle active. As long as you don't know what's going to happen, the mind keeps building scenarios, keeps evaluating probabilities, keeps searching for information to reduce the uncertainty, keeps producing the alert state that accompanies that search. The question of what you can do right now with what you have interrupts that cycle in a way few other things can, because the question doesn't seek to eliminate uncertainty about the future. It leaves it there. But it shifts attention from the uncertainty of the future to the certainty of the present. What do I have right now? That's certain. I can see it, touch it, verify it. What can I do right now? That's also certain. I can identify the actions available in this moment with the resources available in this moment. Those two questions live completely in the present, in the territory of what's certain, in the territory of what depends on you. And by taking attention there, even briefly, You give the nervous system something the uncertainty of the anxious future can never give. An anchor point in the real. Seneca described it as the act of returning to what you have, not to what you might have if the future were different, not to what you had before and perhaps lost, to what you have now. And what you have now, seen with the clarity that deliberate return produces, is frequently more than the anxious state allows you to see. Anxiety tends to make invisible what you already have, while amplifying what you might lose. To make the present seem impoverished compared to the imagined future where everything is at risk. But when you return to the present with the question of what you have and what you can do, what appears is frequently different from what anxiety was showing you. There are resources you hadn't fully seen. There are available capabilities the anxious state was obscuring. There are action options that existed but weren't visible from inside the worry cycle. And there are people around you, in the real present, who deserve the presence anxiety was stealing from you. Marcus Aurelius practiced it in this sense too. Not just as abstract philosophical discipline, as the most practical way to maintain the effectiveness his position required in conditions where anxiety could have paralyzed any reasonable human being. Returning to the present wasn't for him a personal wellness practice separate from his work. It was his way of working. The clarity the present produced was directly the clarity his decisions required. The anxious future doesn't produce that clarity. It only produces the noise of all possible scenarios competing simultaneously for attention. The present, with its concrete question of what you can do right now, cuts through that noise. And in that momentary silence of the anxious noise, the answer you need is frequently available in a way it wasn't from inside the cycle. That's not abstract philosophy. It's the direct experience of anyone who practices this with enough consistency. And that direct experience is exactly what today's 10th lesson invites you toward. Not to believe it in the abstract, to practice it and verify it in your own experience. The tool is simple, the practice is constant. And the result, verified by 3 men who lived 2,000 years ago in circumstances none of us would voluntarily choose, is real. The present is accessible. Always. Even now. Especially now. Go there. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. And before this episode closes completely, there's something about the practice you carry with you that deserves to be said in the most direct way possible. The practice of returning to the present isn't easy at first, especially for someone who spent years, perhaps decades, with the habit of anxiety deeply installed. The habit of living in the anxious future has the strength of everything that's been practiced for a long time. It won't fully yield to a few weeks of deliberate practice. That's not a reason not to practice. It's a reason to have realistic expectations about what practice produces and when it produces it. The Stoics didn't promise instant transformations. They promised something different, more honest and more lasting. That consistent work produces real change. Not from one week to the next, but over months and years of practice that gradually makes easier what was difficult at first, more automatic, what initially required deliberate effort, more natural, what at first seemed completely foreign to how the mind worked. Marcus Aurelius spent decades practicing, not because he was slow to learn, but because he understood that character, the quality of who you are, in the moments where it matters most, isn't built all at once. It's built through constant repetition of the right work. And the right work in the case of anxiety is exactly this. Notice when the mind goes to the future. Bring it back. Ask it what it can do right now with what it has. Act if there's action available. Release if there's no action available. Return again and again. without expecting it to be perfect, without getting frustrated that it's imperfect, with the patience of someone who knows the work is long-term and that each repetition, though it may seem small, contributes to something being built beyond what's visible in the moment. Seneca put it with his characteristic urgency. Don't wait to be completely ready. Start where you are, with what you have, with the imperfect practice available now. Because today's imperfect practice is the foundation of tomorrow's more skillful practice. And tomorrow's more skillful practice is the foundation of the day after's real capacity. That's the path. Not dramatic, not transformative overnight, but real, available to you right now, with the anxiety you have, with the uncertainty you have, with everything that exists in your life right now, including what's difficult. The present is still there, and it's always possible to return to it. Start now, with the next time the mind goes to the future. That's the first step, and that first step, taken now, is enough. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. There's something the 4 episodes of this initial block of the series have in common that's worth naming now that we're at the close of the 5th. Each of them described a way the mind, when not directed with awareness, produces unnecessary suffering. The first showed automatic reaction, the mind responding from impulse without passing through choice. The second showed the space, the distance between stimulus and response, where the possibility of choosing instead of reacting lives. The third showed anger, the mind discharging outward, destroying what it built. The fourth showed fear, the mind building stories about threats that probably won't materialize the way it fears. And this 5th showed anxiety, the mind living in the future while the present passes without being inhabited. 5 episodes, 5 forms of suffering that aren't inevitable, that have alternatives, that have been practiced by real human beings in circumstances far more difficult than most of what any of us face in everyday life. And those alternatives, those practices that transform the relationship with the mind instead of being governed by it, are available to you, not as a promise that everything will be fine, as the real possibility of living what you have more fully, of being more present in the conversations that matter, of acting from clarity instead of from alarm, of inhabiting the present instead of spending it anticipating the future, of being more free, not from circumstances, within them. That freedom is what this series is building episode by episode. Not dramatically or all at once, brick by brick, practice by practice, return by return. The present is waiting for you, always. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. One last thing before closing. Anxiety has a characteristic none of today's lessons mention directly, but that whoever lives it knows well. It's persistent. It doesn't disappear because you had a good day. It doesn't resolve because you practiced presence for a week. It doesn't fully yield because you intellectually understood everything this episode described. It comes back. And when it comes back, it can feel as if the work had served no purpose, as if the returns to the present hadn't changed anything, as if anxiety was still exactly as strong as always. That's not true, but it feels that way. And it's important to know that before it happens, so that when it happens, it isn't a surprise that dismantles what you're building. Marcus Aurelius wrote meditations for years, not weeks, years, not because he was slow to learn, but because he understood that practice is a continuous process with no definitive arrival point. That the work of governing yourself is the work of a lifetime, not a quarterly project. And in his meditations there are moments where the same idea appears in slightly different forms, where he reminds himself of things he already knew, where he returns to principles he'd established long ago, not because he'd forgotten them, because the deliberate return to the principles that matter is part of the work. It's how they stay alive as real practices instead of becoming ideas that are known but not used. Seneca did it throughout his life. Epictetus too. Both knew the work didn't end, and instead of being frustrated by that, they accepted it as the nature of the work. And you can accept it too, not as resignation, as the clarity of someone who knows anxiety will return, and that when it does, the tool is still available. Notice, ask, act, or release. Return. Always return. That's the work. And that work, done today and tomorrow and the day after, is exactly what you're doing right now by having made it this far. The present is waiting for you. This is Stoicism for winners. This is Master Your Mind. Now comes the part that separates those who listen from those who truly change. This community exists because you decide it exists, not with words, with actions. If something you heard today moved you inside, leave your reflection here. The one that gets the most support becomes the banner of this community, the collective voice of everyone who chose not to give up. A community that doesn't run from pain, that walks through it, with courage, with judgment, with honor. But listening isn't enough. You know it. You feel it. There's a difference between the one who consumes wisdom and the one who turns it into armor. That's why we created the Stoic Code. 2 principles forged over millennia by the most powerful minds in history. It's not just another book. It's a manual of psychological warfare against your own weaknesses. Each principle includes the deep teaching, its modern application, and an exercise you can implement today, not tomorrow, today. If you decide to get it, you're not just taking something for your growth. You become part of this mission. You help us bring Stoicism to thousands of people who are right now where you once were, who struggle, who fall, who need a word to remind them who they are. Your support keeps this podcast alive. It drives it. It expands it. Thanks to you, this doesn't stop. The link is in the description of this episode. Everything you need is right there. We'll see you in the next episode of Stoicism for Winners. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, without fail. Stoic sessions designed to be with you when life gets heavy, when staying calm is hard, when you need someone to remind you who you are before you forget it yourself. Follow us. The Stoic who doesn't train in calm won't find calm when the storm arrives. Until the next episode, we walk this path together, and every day there are more of us who choose not to give up. Remember this: you are the sole owner of your perception, the architect of your peace, the only one responsible for the war you choose to fight or the one you choose to end. That is Stoicism, not a philosophy, a way of being unbreakable. This is Stoicism for Winners.